Welcome to Episode 2 of the Chronicles of Orn, Book 1, Chosen. This is a work of fiction written by W.J.R. Pollard. All characters and events in this story are fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons or events are unintentional. For younger viewers, parental guidance advised. Please subscribe, leave a like and comment below. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 7. Venna was beside herself, while Eric was just stunned. He could only stare at his brother helplessly. His mind couldn't process what had just happened. Two of the ship's crew helped Venna lift Orn and move him into the ship's cabin. His convulsions had ceased, but he remained unconscious. The crewmen tasked with charting their course were perplexed. They still had the wind behind them, and the sun low on the western horizon over the port side of the ship. The crew could determine they were still on a northerly heading, and knew it was sometime in the afternoon, but nothing beyond that. The man on the bow cried out into the eerie silence, shocking everyone into alertness. "Land ho!" the tillerman replied. "Where away?" "Ahead off the larboard bow." Eric finally recovered somewhat and moved to the left of the ship, where he saw sailors pointing. Sure enough, he could see a smudge on the horizon. He could hear the Jarl and the navigator in a frantic discussion, trying to plot exactly where they were. "We should move closer to shore, see if we can spot any recognizable landmarks," said Sigtrin. His first mate responded, "What if it's the Empire, my lord?" "I'm well aware it could be, but we need to know, one way or another," said Sigtrin. "Well, I've said my piece. The decision's yours, my lord," said a now resigned first mate. Sigtrin closed his eyes as he pinched the bridge of his nose, then sighed. "Bring her over to port. We'll move in closer." "Aye, my lord." As they crept towards the coast, a sense of concern settled over the crew. They drew closer to the smudge on the horizon, and things began sharpening into focus. They could see a heavily forested region, and several bicolored sails in the distance. Someone cried out, "They're ours! Praise the gods, they're ours!" Some of the sailors whooped with delight, while some looked around, bewildered as their minds tried to ponder where they were. Others merely dropped to their knees, faces lifted to the sky. After a short time, they sailed alongside the nearest vessel, and a crewman called out, "Ahoy! What coast is that over there?" "You're around 50 miles northeast of Tverdalsoy," replied the other ship's sailor. "Many thanks." The men couldn't believe what they were hearing. Almost a week's journey in less than a day. However, meaningful glances were being directed towards where Orn lay recovering. The crew engaged in hushed conversations among themselves. "That boy is God's touched. That's for sure. Never thought I would ever see anything like that. Aye. He is definitely a child of the gods." Venna, kneeling by Orn's side, was fighting back tears. She held a damp cloth in her left hand, dabbing Orn's face while her other held his. "My stupid, stupid boy. What have you done? What have you done?" she sobbed quietly in a pleading voice as tears streamed down her cheeks. She placed the cloth on his forehead and brought his hand to her lips. Swatting away tears with her free hand, she sniffled, struggling to keep herself together. Jarl Sigtrin entered the cabin area and knelt next to Venna. When he cast a glance toward her, a wave of discomfort came over him. He wanted to console her, but he was at a loss for what he could say or do. He looked at Orn, and placing a gentle tentative hand on her shoulder, spoke in a hushed tone. "How is the lad? Do we know what ails him, Lady Venna?" Venna turned to Sigtrin, considering how she would explain, when Orn groaned, and his eyes opened slightly. He squinted and asked in a soft, croaky voice, "Mother, where am I?" Venna breathed a sigh of relief and said to him, "Don't worry about that now. You rest, all right? Rest now." She caressed his cheek, and held onto his hand as he slipped back into unconsciousness. As his breathing came deep and steady, and his tremors ceased, Venna almost collapsed with exhaustion. She regained some composure and turned to face the Jarl, telling him, "It's been a stressful time, and the toll it has taken has finally caught up with him." She felt terrible being dishonest with Sigtrin, but she was still hoping to conceal Orn's ability. Deep down she knew it was futile, but concealing his secret had become second nature. The Jarl took on a gentle expression as he said, "Lady Venna, please." "I saw." Venna's eyes teared up as she looked helplessly at him. "I'm sorry. I have been trying to hide it for so long. What do I do? They will take him from me. When they learn of him, I'll lose him. I can't. I can't lose any more. That isn't necessarily true. You can always ensure that you stay with him. I mean, you're famous. You are the Shield Maiden, Lady Venna. They will listen to you, I'm certain. Her voice went soft as a small glimmer of hope lit her eyes. You think so? There are songs and poems about you, the Jarl said as he smiled reassuringly. It means you have skill enough for people to want to emulate you, to learn from you. Besides, when does it ever hurt to ask? Venna reached up and clasped the Jarl's hand, as her eyes expressed to him the gratitude her lips could not. Barely holding herself together, she worried that if she spoke another word, she would break down again. Jarl Sigtrun smiled briefly in acknowledgement, stood, and said, Please, lie down and rest. I will check in on him from time to time. We will be in Flodavra in the morning. Venna carefully lay down next to Orn, and as her exhaustion took over, she drifted to sleep. They slept through the night, and in the morning Orn stirred, which woke Venna. She shot upright, looking him over, and pressed her hand to his forehead. When she was sure he was all right, she glanced to her right to see Eric was sleeping on her other side. She moved outside the ship's cabin, and looking ahead, saw they were approaching Flodavra, the Grand Duchy of Holvila's capital city. She moved towards the rudder to where Sigtrun was steering. When he saw her, he said, Good morning. I hope you slept well. How is the boy? He seems to be doing better. He's still sleeping. Ah, good. We should arrive at the dock soon. Let's leave him be until we need to go ashore. Venna nodded, and sat beside him. The pair stayed in companionable silence as the city loomed larger. Sigtrun broke the silence by ordering his first mate to furl sail and deploy the oars. They had arrived. They glided alongside a large pier, and threw lines across to the waiting dockhands. Once they'd made the ship secure, Jarl Sigtrun leapt across the small gap between the ship and the dock. He then walked over to the harbour master, who was busy directing dockworkers to move around cargo as he made notes on a piece of slate with some chalk. The Jarl interrupted him by saying, I am Jarl Sigtrun of Bossberg. I need to get a message to the palace. The Nevans have attacked Softjerland. The harbour master was a rotund man in his early 50s with close-cropped auburn hair, and a beard which seemed to grow out from his eyes. His jowls and double chin gave him the appearance of an upright walking bulldog. He flashed the man interrupting him a look of annoyance, but then as he registered what he had just been told, the colour drained from his face, and he began waving his arms about. Stop. Stop working. He then said to Jarl Sigtrun, I'll fetch you a horse. Better the palace guards hear it from you yourself, my lord. He then turned and took a deep breath. Finn. Here. Now. A wiry-looking young man of around 20 dashed over from among the dockworkers and answered, Yes, Holdred. Fetch his lordship here a fast horse immediately. Yup, right away. Ah, which one, Holdred? Anyone. Hurry, man. Right, sorry. Right away, he said, standing in place. Today, Finn. The harbour master, Holdred, looked at the young man in exasperation. Finn jolted a little and said, Oh right. Let me just. Then he dashed off to the stables. Apologies, my lord, Holdred said, with a pained expression on his face. He shrugged and said, Young folk. The Jarl responded with a nod and a sympathetic smile. He patted the man's shoulder and said, Good man, good man. Holdred shouted to his workers to continue taking inventory of the cargo pile. After a couple of minutes, the young man returned with a large chestnut roan. A fine, sturdy example of equine breeding. He handed the reins to Jarl Sigtrun and said, His name's Bullhead, my lord. On account of he runs with his head down like a charging bull. Jarl Sigtrun's eyebrows lifted and said to the young man, Right. Thank you for that. He accepted the reins and passed Finn a silver coin. Once mounted, he tapped his heels into the flanks of the muscular horse, and galloped out of the docks area, and on to the ducal palace. Around 2 hours later, Jarl Sigtrun returned, leading a procession of armed and armoured huskarls on horseback, formed up to the front and rear of a royal carriage and an iron-caged wagon. The Jarl dismounted and led the horse back over to the harbour master, thanked him and passed him a couple of coins. Venna and Eric had disembarked from the ship with Venna looking every inch the warrior in her black lamella armour, and black leather trousers and boots. She had her round shield strapped to her back, and her sword belted to her waist. Orn had his arm over Eric's shoulder, as he was still weak from his episode the previous day. Two of Sigtryn's men held the bald Nevin secure between them. Both men were wrinkling their noses, wearing expressions of distaste. The man had soiled himself, having spent the entire journey strapped to the mast. Sigtryn and the Avdlaks boarded the royal carriage while two rear ducal huskels dismounted and took custody of the prisoner. Then the procession left the dock. The sound of many shod horses' hooves striking cobbled streets resounded from the buildings of various vendors and taverns on the road to the palace. The buildings of Flodavra were almost all made of stone, with large glass windows at the front of many of the businesses. However, in typical Holder fashion, the streets meandered around clusters of buildings with no obvious planning or forethought. In a compound surrounded by sheer, 20-foot-high walls, the palace made for a defensible structure against attacks by land or sea. The wall and the main building's durability came from the large blue stone blocks utilized in their construction. Built flush along the back wall of the palace were two towers, one at each end of the back wall atop a small cliff at the water's edge. Topping these towers were giant ballistae. The procession passed under the portcullis, into a large compound, which included a broad stone path of about 200 feet long, leading up to, and surrounding a large circular garden. Lining the path on either side were rows of pine trees, ending 20 yards before the path split, branching off to encircle the garden, and off in both directions, disappearing around the sides of the building. The procession followed around to the right of the circle, to pull up with a carriage door facing the palace, which stood open. A pair of tall, muscular warriors stood on each side of the outward opening doors of the entrance. Each wore pristine steel chainmail, and polished rounded helmets with patterned eye and nose guards attached. Over their armor were surcoats in the King of Utstadland's colors, dark purple with a gold motif of the king's crown at the center. They were each armed with a large bearded, single-blade, two-handed axe. A palace servant came to the door of the carriage and opened it, at which point Sigtryn and the Avdlaks alighted. Venna retrieved her shield and reattached her sword to her belt as Eric helped his brother down. The chamberlain of the Grand Duke came out to meet them. A tall, thin, fussy man with a neat, trimmed graying blonde beard and curled mustachios. He wore a black robe with silver piping around the sleeve cuffs, and a floppy green velvet cap with a large feather covered his head. He regarded the arrivals with undisguised disdain. His expression displayed a momentary tinge of fear as his eyes met the icy stare of the warrior woman beside the very junior noble. He recomposed himself and said to the huskels, "Take the prisoner to the guardhouse cells. His grace will call for the man to be brought before him, should he so decide. The rest of you, follow me, please." And with that, he turned and went back inside without waiting to see if they were following. Sigtryn and the Avdlak family made to follow him, but as Venna approached the entryway, it was as though two warrior statues came to life. With a frightening quickness, Venna found her path barred by the heads of the soldiers' axes. The soldier to her left stated firmly, "No one under arms may go before the king." Venna flashed the soldier a sweet smile and said, "You're welcome to take mine from me if you think you can." She unstrapped her shield and adopted a fighter's stance. The chamberlain turned around and asked impatiently, "What is the hold-up?" "Let them pass." The soldier repeated, "No one under arms may go before the king." Like lightning, Venna drew her sword, and began pounding her shield with it. Her eyes were afire, and her grin turned feral. Then she said in a loud, clear voice, "I am Shield Maiden Venna Avdlak, wife of Vilda Avdlak. I will surrender my sword to no man. Stand in my way, and be cut down." The two imposing warriors displayed their sudden doubts by shooting glances at each other as they nervously shuffled their feet, and tightened their grip on their axes. The name, Venna Avdlak, was known to them. A slow clap and a breathy deep chuckle broke the standoff as King Ulden Argensson of Utstadland, overlord of all Haldermen, emerged from within the palace. He did not dress in a kingly fashion, wearing a plain-looking purple tunic with black hose and boots. Dark grey hair framed with a pale blue right eye seemed to pierce to the heart of all things, whereas his left eyelid closed over an empty socket with a thick, vertical scar through it from mid-forehead to his jaw. As he walked outside, he negligently brushed aside the axes barring the way and approached Venna, who had now lowered her arms and bowed her head. Tears fell from her eyes, and with a voice that started breaking, she said, "Father, they took him from me." To the shock of all, the king embraced her, and pressed his lips against her head as she sobbed into his shoulder. Venna and the king remained in their embrace for a few moments more, while he whispered in her ear. What words they exchanged, those gathered could only guess. He held her away from himself as he looked upon her, to ensure she had recomposed herself. The king turned, with one arm still around Vena's shoulders, and waved away his guards. He led them all inside the palace to where the rest of the nation's rulers had gathered, and Vena filled him in about the raid on Mythwich. King Ulden brought Vena, Jarl Sigtrin, Eric, and Orn into the meeting room. There was a large, varnished, oval-shaped table in its center. The table was a 6-inch thick cross-section of a gigantic tree, around 16 feet in its widest diameter, with thick legs attached to it. Some servants brought in additional chairs for the new arrivals, while King Ulden made the introductions. The king was lord of all the Holder people and governed Stadland directly. He also controlled the 3 other nations through their rulers, his 3 sons. The kingdom of Stadland was on the northwestern border of Holvila. The first to speak was Grand Duke Viggen, a tall, wiry man. His features were a strange contrast of dark, almost black eyes, with white-colored hair, and a long thin beard reaching his sternum. He was the king's eldest son, and heir to the throne. He addressed Vena. "So, half-sister, eh? I've heard of you, but I'm not surprised you made a name on your own, considering your bloodline." Vena dipped her head and responded, "Your Grace. Come now, we aren't in public, so no need for formality. After all, we are family. Apparently." As Viggen said this, the other rulers laughed and thumped the table, throwing suggestive looks in the king's direction. They were already deep in their cups. Orn could only sit there silently, still exhausted. But Eric, feeling his mother was being insulted, stood up, and thumped the table as he glared at Viggen. Hrolf, the king's youngest, a bear of a man with deep blue eyes, red-brown hair, and beard, slapped the table and guffawed, then said, "Would you look at that, Viggen? The pup bares his fangs." This brought out fresh gales of laughter. The remaining man with light red hair and beard, and light brown, almost golden eyes, set in a sharp-featured face, chimed in with, "What do you expect, Hrolf? He's our nephew, after all." "You make a fine point, Thane, a fine point," Hrolf stated as he continued laughing. The king allowed his sons to joke around a little longer before standing, and tapping his empty horn cup on the table like a gavel. "My sons, we have a new situation. It would seem there was an attack on our people, a violation of our sovereignty." At this, the smiles and relaxed air of the meeting evaporated. The king continued, "While it requires further investigation, the evidence is pointing towards an incursion into Sofgerland by a group of Nevan Imperial legionnaires." King Ulden allowed that to sink in before continuing. "No Avdlak killed some of them, and captured one who is being held in the guardhouse cells as we speak." As King Ulden was saying this, Orn slid off his chair to the right, and Vena quickly moved to grab him. The king saw this and yelled, "Get Gerald in here now." Vena lowered Orn to the floor as outside. The sounds of chinking metal and stomping feet announced palace guards running off to summon Gerald Winter, the king's mage. Vena held Orn, a frantic look on her face. After a short while, an elderly man in brown flowing robes with long light grey hair and beard walked into the room. Gerald was not tall by Holder norms, standing at around 5 feet, 10 inches. However, he carried himself with an undeniable gravitas. He crouched down with surprising ease, held his right hand over Orn's forehead, and turned to the soldiers at the door. As he signaled them, Gerald said, "Bring him to my quarters. You," he pointed at Vena, "come with us." With that, they carried Orn from the room, with Vena trailing behind. Eric started moving to follow when Grand Duke Viggen said, "Boy, stay. You were present in the village." Eric swallowed nervously and nodded. It was all he could do. His mind was a rush of thoughts, navigating all the revelations dropped on him in quick succession. How he was supposed to get all this new information straightened out, he had no idea. For the moment, he would do as he was asked. How could he not? It was a direction from his sovereign. "Good, you can give testimony in place of your mother." Viggen stood, placed his hand on his heart, and declared formally, "As you are my kin by blood, I, Viggen Uldenson, vouch for your words as truth before Everin, the All-Father." King Ulden then said, "Viggen, summon the Nevan ambassador, so we can gauge his reaction to the boy's testimony." "Of course, Father. Might I suggest we conduct this in the throne room? A more formal setting seems appropriate for this business." "Very well, it shall be as you say." To give the occasion additional formality, the men retired to their rooms to don their stately robes and crowns before proceeding to the main throne room. The king sat down on the throne, and standing on the dais to his right was Grand Duke Viggen. Duke Hrolf and Duke Thane stood to his left. Eric was front left at the foot of the dais. Palace guards brought the prisoner in and pushed him down into a prostrate position before the holder rulers. He made as if to speak, but a vicious kick from a guard cut him off. The other guard hissed at him. "You will speak when spoken to, maggot." The prisoner had no clue what the words meant, but the implications were obvious, so he held his tongue. A herald's voice cut through the low chatter of the assembled royals, his deep voice announcing, "Gallad Crassus, ambassador for the Nevan Empire." Not long after, a short man with short dark hair and hazel eyes entered, wearing a white toga, with a light blue cape hanging off the left shoulder in the Nevan fashion. He stopped 10 feet from the dais and knelt before the array of royalty before him. "Rise," said the king in a soft but firm voice, amplified by the acoustics of the audience chamber. "You summoned me, your majesty?" Gallad asked. "I did, Gallad. I did." "Ah, forgive me, your majesty, but why? Do you see that man there?" The king motioned to Vanna. Gallad nodded and said, "I see him, your majesty." "In your native tongue, ask him his name." "As you wish." Gallad turned to the prisoner, and in Nevan, asked his name. The prisoner responded with a long, pleading diatribe, which was sharply cut off by the ambassador, who asked the same question again. He got an answer this time and faced the king to say, "His name is Luca Vanna, your majesty." "Luca Vanna," the king drawled. "Tell him I may spare his life, if he tells me why he was involved in an assault on my lands and people, by Nevan men wearing uniforms of the Nevan Imperial Legions." Gallad's face suddenly drained of color, and he stood there wide-eyed, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Did you not understand the request, ambassador?" Your majesty, yes I did," Gallad stammered. "But this cannot be right. This cannot be." Eric, speaking slowly, to the best of your recollection, recount the events of the attack on your village. Please begin with the moment you first realized your village was under assault. Leave nothing out. Eric did as the king asked, and as he went on, detailing what he remembered, the Nevan ambassador looked like he was going to be sick. As Eric was finishing his recounting, Gallad's jaw clenched, and he was visibly trembling. Gallad finally said, "Majesty, I know nothing of this. I can say with certainty that this was not a sanctioned action. We Nevans honor our treaties." He turned to the prisoner and spoke Nevan in a harsh, pejorative tone, before turning back to the king. "Your majesty, this man is a citizen of the Nevan Empire, but I offer him no protection. I need to send a message to my government." "By your leave, majesty, and your graces," he said as he bowed to each one on the dais. King Ulden, from his seat on the throne, turned his face to the left slowly and dismissed him with a languid wave of his hand. As the ambassador hurried from the chamber, the guards dragged the prisoner to his feet and took him back to his cell. The king then waved toward the hanging tapestries, in a gesture signaling someone to come forth. A man emerged from concealment and approached the dais. He had tan skin, a prominent hooked nose, and dark brown eyes with a hard look in them. Black curly hair peeked out from under a dark blue fez, and he wore loose-fitting black pants, topped by a green long-sleeved silk shirt and a black silk vest. Shufi bin Said, a middle-aged Azari nomad, and the king's spy. The Nevan Imperial Legion's inexorable march south through the desert to expand their empire had resulted in the Nevan conquest of his people. He knelt before the dais and said, "I live to serve, great king. Rise, Shufi. I have need of you. See to it that the Nevan ambassador's messages do not leave Holvila. Not a one. Your command, great king." Once he was gone from the chamber, the holder royals, with Eric, began filing out. As they neared the side door behind the dais, Vigan clasped Eric's shoulder and said to a nearby guardsman, "Take him to his family in Gerald Winter's quarters." "Right away, your grace." "This way, young master." King Ulden then turned to Vigan and said, "I know you have a good relationship with the ambassador, and that you find him somewhat trustworthy. I cannot put faith in that, because while he may be ignorant of this, we don't know the extent of his government's involvement. Confine him in comfortable quarters, suitable for a man of his status. Father, surely that won't be necessary if we just talk to the man." "I have spoken, so shall it be. As my king commands. On an unrelated matter, may we?" Vigan's face took on a pained expression as he hesitated. "Yes, what is it, my son? May I have a word with you, in private, father?" Harolf interjected in a chiding tone. "Come now, brother, no secrets from us. It's unrelated to this happening." It's our personal matter, and one which is none of your concern, Hrolf. We are family, son. Hrolf is right. Well, out with it. What's on your mind? Viggen's expression became even more pained. He took a deep breath, then sighed and said, It's about the boy, Eric. What about him? As you know, I'm 29, and I have had many, I have been as indiscreet as you were in the past. But unlike you, nothing has come of it. I think. Viggen closed his eyes to collect himself before ploughing on. I think I will never father a child of my own. The room went quiet. The younger two brothers glanced from one to the other. None of them knew what to say after this revelation. The king finally broke the awkward silence with a simple, Thane finally snapped out of his shock, and offered, You mentioned the boy. What about him? A good question. Well, Viggen, asked the king. He is a direct descendant of yours, father. And you just saw him. He must be going through hell in that mind of his. And yet he gave his testimony like a statesman. The boy flared up at me in defense of his mother's honor, knowing full well who I was. Your blood is his blood, and it shows, by the gods, it does. If I adopt him, it will legitimize him, and I can name him my heir. What nonsense is this? You would have the son of a bastard, our future king, shouted Hrolf indignantly. If you are half-man, then I will be Grand Duke, and you can go to Bruderman. Viggen launched at his brother, his face red from shame and anger. Before he could close the gap, Thane intercepted him, hugging him and holding him back. You've always been an avaricious little turd, you fat sod. I should have drowned you when you were born. Viggen spat at Hrolf. Enough, roared King Ulden. He turned on Hrolf with a hard stare, and in a menacingly calm voice said, You, Hrolf, are my youngest. Though I love you, you are an idiot. Thane, you are not much more intelligent, but you are wise enough to know your limitations. Know this. Viggen will be your king. And you, Hrolf, will never mention this again, understood? Hrolf, sore from his ambition being thwarted the moment he had a taste of it, was still aware enough to know a royal decree when he heard one. He bowed his head and muttered, Yes, father. Your will be done. What of you, Thane? We know Hrolf's thoughts as, clearly, he never learned the art of subtlety. Do you have any objections? Do you not think you should be considered to assume the throne I shall one day vacate? Thane chuckled and said, No, father. I don't want to be king. I love my land, I love my people, and I love having as much freedom as I do. I'm happy as is, so I've no objections. The king chuckled softly. As I thought. Well then. Viggen, you have our consent to ask the boy's mother. I would say after we resolve this recent happening would be the appropriate time. Thank you, father. But what of the younger brother? Orn, wasn't it? Asked Thane. King Ulden answered soberly, He is blessed, gods touched. You mean God touched? No. I mean gods, as in plural. He'll be an elemental mage, and from what I hear, an extraordinarily powerful one. Untrained. He caused the ship carrying them from Softgerland to make the journey in less than 2 days. Normally, it should take at least a week. Chapter 8. In the well-appointed quarters of Gerald Winter, Orn lay on the large, canopied bed. Seated on the bed next to him, holding his hand, sat Venna. Venna had described to Gerald what had happened over the previous 2 days. He listened, giving the occasional and, aha. Once she finished recounting, he said, I'm fairly certain I know what happened. He has channeled too much energy through his mind. This is a case where his power is far beyond his capacity to control and contain it. Give me a few moments. Gerald lifted the lid of the trunk near his window and began rummaging around inside it. He then exclaimed, Aha! That's where you were hiding. He returned to Orn's side and placed a small opaque, dark grey stone on the boy's forehead. Placing both his hands over the stone, he slipped into a deep, trance-like state. His lips moved as though speaking an incantation, but the whispering sound, rather than emitting from him, was diffuse and seemed to emanate from everywhere. The ambient light in the room darkened noticeably for several seconds, as the stone on Orn's head radiated a dim, blue light. Then, with a short rushing sound like a sharp inhale of breath, all returned to normal. Orn's eyes fluttered open, and he sat upright. His eyes were wide as they swept over unfamiliar surroundings, But upon seeing his mother's face, he calmed down. He then noticed the robed elderly gentleman off to his left, and gave a nervous, "Hello," before giving a quizzical look to his mother. Venner flashed a gentle smile at her son, and said, "This is the king's mage, Gerald Vinter. He brought you back to us." She looked at Gerald, the gratitude clear on her face. Orn made as though to get up. However, with little effort, his mother arrested his movement, placing a hand on his chest. "You need to rest, dear." "But I feel fine, mother, look." Venner flashed him a look he had seen all too many times, and he knew better than to defy it. He sank back down, which returned Venner's expression to a relaxed smile. Gerald patiently stood off to the side. He was glad to let Venner see her child recovering. In an attempt at subtlety, he cleared his throat to get her attention. When her slate-grey eyes turned their gaze to him, he inclined his head toward the door, then proceeded towards the door. Venner gave Orn's hand one more reassuring squeeze, and followed Gerald outside. Once they were out of the room, Gerald's expression changed to one of a teacher scolding a student, as he asked, "How long have you known?" Venner, despite herself, affected a well-chastised expression, in tune with the way he spoke to her. She looked at her feet, and answered in a subdued voice, "About a year or so." That was unwise. And dangerous. She began shrinking within herself, but then her usual stern demeanor reasserted itself. She overcame her momentary reflexive deference to the mage, and shot back at him. "But I know how it is. I was on the king's guard as a shield maiden." Gerald attempted to interject, but could only get out part of a word before Venner ploughed on. With all the bloody intrigues, the petty quibbling, and jockeying for position and power amongst rotten half-men who should be shoved back onto a ship to relearn their place. With the potential Orn has, and with his innocence, those half-men would. He grabbed her shoulders with both hands and in a conciliatory tone said, I know, I understand. However, that boy needs to be taught. The fact he can use two elements simultaneously, and on such a scale." Gerald let go of her shoulders as he calmed himself, and went on, "The next time might very well kill him. He needs to learn control and restraint until his mental strength and discipline can catch up to his power." Venner's face took on a defeated expression as she looked towards the room where her youngest rested, tears threatening to spill over. "Venner, permit me to take him as my pupil. I will take full responsibility, and I will ensure that he is kept away from all the petty politicking. I give my word, as the king's mage." Venner turned back to regard Gerald, and after her eyes scanned his face for several seconds, finally nodded. "All right. Besides, I don't think there are many in the world who could train him. His potential is even greater than mine. Between you and me, of course." He winked as he added, "If you tell anyone I said that, I'll deny it." The mirthful twinkle in Gerald's eyes belied the haughty expression on his face, which elicited a wan smile from Venner. He gently stroked his beard, his expression turning thoughtful as he mused. "I have a strong feeling, though, that, even as my pupil, it will be some time before you will need to part with him." As he said that, they heard the approaching footsteps of Eric and a guard. Venner turned and, upon seeing Eric, moved to enfold him in her arms. She said, "Your brother is doing a lot better. He's resting, but you can see him if you like. Just try to keep from riling him up, all right? He's still recovering." "All right, mother." Eric moved to the door, quietly opened it, and slipped inside. He could hear his mother and Gerald continue talking in hushed tones as he slowly closed the door. The hinge groaned as the latch neared the doorjamb, and Eric heard the lid of a trunk shut. He spotted the flash of movement as a form leapt from the window to the bed. "I saw you, Orn." "No, you didn't. You just think you did." A wry grin spread across Eric's face. He was a little wary of his brother, as memories flashed in his mind's eye of the oddities throughout the last year. The most recent being on board the ship and the fire pit in the village square. "Eric. Are you there, Eric? Where did you go?" Orn asked, in a tone rife with sarcasm and mirth. Eric suddenly snapped out of his reverie and took on a sullen expression as he retorted, "Shut up, I was thinking." "Ew. Does it hurt?" Eric's momentary trepidation evaporated as he had the sudden urge to leap onto his brother and throttle him, but dismissed the thought as suddenly as he felt it. He rather enjoyed living, so he would not do something that would upset his mother. Instead, he replied, "Clearly you're feeling better than mother believes. Drawing it out so we can keep being babied, are we?" Rather than return with a further jibe, Orn looked at Eric with a serious and apprehensive look on his face. In a small voice, he said to his brother, "Eric, I'm scared." Eric, anticipating his brother's next jab, was in the process of thinking up clever retorts, so Orn's sincerity took him aback. His expression softened as he climbed onto the bed, laying down next to Orn. He then turned his head to his brother and said, "You'll be fine. You've got mother, and you've got me. Besides, the old geezer outside said something about helping you with the you know." Eric made a whoosh sound as he moved his hand in a wave-like motion. Orn turned his head toward Eric to regard his big brother before returning his gaze to the ceiling and nodding. Eric then said, "You must be hungry." "I know I am. Wanna go eat?" "Yes, actually. I'm starving. Let's go see what we can find. Besides, I wanna explore a bit. This place is bloody enormous." Eric smiled a smile that one could only describe as slightly demented. Orn cast a nervous look at the door as Eric said that. Worried an errant slap would fly out of nowhere for him swearing. He said, "But what about mother? There's no way she'll let us wander around." Eric tapped the side of his nose slyly and then, after rolling off the bed, crept exaggeratedly to the door, and slowly reached his hand to the door latch. The door suddenly swung inwards, and Eric yelped as he leapt back from it. Venna had a look of suspicion on her face as she asked Eric, "What were you doing just now?" Eric, replying a little too fast, said, "What, me? Nothing, I wasn't doing anything. What would I be doing?" He chuckled nervously as he flashed an unconvincingly innocent smile. Venna gave him a long, dubious look before moving past him to check on Orn. He was sitting up and said to Venna, "Eric and I were just going to see about something to eat." "I'll go get you something, dear." "No, really, mother. I'm feeling a lot better. I'd like to get up." Venna looked back towards Gerald, who was standing in the doorway. He gave a quick, reassuring nod. She turned back to Orn and said, "All right, but we'll have to tell someone. You can't just go wandering around." Gerald held up his hand and interjected, "It's fine. I can show them. You too, Venna, you should eat." With that, they left Gerald's quarters in search of the kitchen. In the meeting room, the royals pored over maps of Sofjaland Strait, working toward deducing where the Nevan ship would take Vilda. Viggen suggested, surely the ship would have returned to Pakwaraneva, the Nevan capital. It's populous, it's the center of their power, and they would want to report to their leaders. Thane rebutted that notion. "No, I don't think so. We haven't had a Nevan attempt at incursion for decades. I think they would have dashed for the nearest port the wind would allow for." Hrolf then said, "We have to assume they could have landed anywhere on the Nevan coast, from directly south, along the coast towards the east. What about this coastline running north, to the southwest of Sofjaland?" The king spoke up as he pointed to the map contours. "No, Hrolf, that coastline is mostly cliffs, and there are no port towns to speak of along there. They took captives. I suspect that was part of their plan. They'll want to go where there's a market for them." Right. That makes sense. So that leaves Discipica and Rogus as the two most likely places, said Hrolf. Thane interjected, "Going by the rough estimate of their departure time before first light, I would wager Rogus." The king smiled at that, but Hrolf looked confused. "How do you figure?" Viggen responded, "I get where he's coming from. See, the winds in the strait are around the center of a large, shifting spiral. This makes it reasonably predictable in that region. The wind blows in a northwesterly direction in the evening, and southeasterly in the morning." King Ulden straightened up, and with his hands on the back of his hips, tilted his shoulders back. He winced as audible pops emanated from his lower spine. "Arg, I need to avoid bending like that, phew," he said with a wry laugh. "Getting old, father." Viggen chuckled as he teased the old man. "Seasoned, you cheeky brat, seasoned. So, do we all agree? Rogus will be the start of our search." Viggen and Thane nodded their agreement, whereas Hrolf voiced an objection. "While I get that they're our countrymen, why go to all this trouble to track them down?" Thane began objecting to Hrolf's reasoning, but he plowed on, saying, "They're gone. We should just accept that fact, go crush the Nevan ships, burn their cities, and take home their riches and women in recompense for the affront." Hrolf shrugged as a conclusion to his argument. It was the king who addressed Hrolf's objection. "While I don't disagree with your thinking, Hrolf, The fact is, it's family. Father, don't give me that. They're not my family. I don't know them. That's because Venna is 12 years older than you. She was from a time before I married your queen and mother. Leaving that aside, son, you see this. Alden pointed to his empty eye socket. The man you would abandon is the reason I got away this lightly. Otherwise, I would have been killed long before I put you in your mother. King Alden looked at the faces of his sons and stated in a tone that would brook no dispute. I owe him. We owe him. So we will bring him home one way or another. And, just for you, Hrolf, we'll consider exacting retribution. The king smiled at Hrolf, who flashed an eager grin in return. King Alden finished by saying, our pretense will be a Holvalan diplomatic mission to assess viable trade routes. Starting in Rogus, depending on what can be learned, the delegation will move on from there. We hold court first thing on the morrow, to establish who shall participate in this expedition. The next day, the rulers of the Holder nations had gathered in the main audience chamber. This time, there was a large crowd gathered in the main audience chamber. Nobles, high-ranking members of the military, courtiers, and other court functionaries of note were all summoned to hear an announcement. Among them were the people they would choose to send to Rogus as part of the trade delegation. In addition, close to the dais, were Jarl Sigtrun, Venna, and her 2 sons. King Alden began addressing the assembly by stating, we have summoned you here this morning to declare that we intend to set up a Holderman trading center and embassy in the Nevenport city of Rogus. The assembled crowd began chattering, some eager, others confused. Then the king continued, I have a signed letter of authority from Ambassador Gallad Crassus. Now, we will send a merchant, along with a detachment of capable warriors, to protect our interests. The murmuring crowd grew louder until Grand Duke Viggen's voice cut across the din, silence. Alden flashed an admonishing look at Viggen, which said, I can handle myself, then finished with, the man we require needs to be fluent in Neven, and also needs to be knowledgeable regarding matters of trade. Is there any such man among us? Someone spoke up from the back. I speak Neven. A richly dressed, balding, thick-set man in his 30s stepped forward. His receding hair was auburn, and he had hazel-green eyes under bushy eyebrows. He was clean-shaven, and moved with quick, furtive movements that made his jowls jiggle. He seemed to have a perpetually jovial expression on his round face. And you are? Ah, yes, Majesty. I am Hans Barkhoff, a humble merchant at your service, he said as he bowed with a flourish. Good, good, the king said. My men and I shall guard him, your Majesty. A man of about 6 feet in height, with pale blue eyes, light red blonde, curly hair, and freckles covering his face, dressed in a doublet and tights, with pointed-toe ankle boots, stepped forward. I am Sir Utter Stannan, a knight of Walroburl. And how many men? Asked Viggen. 7, your grace, all knights such as myself. I am their captain. Excellent. The fighting prowess of Oldsbockie knights is something with which we are well familiar, the king said with a wry grin as he gently touched a hand to his empty eye socket. Holvila and Utstadland had a large population of Oldsbockie people. They'd fought a war against the Holdermen and lost around 170 years prior. They had since mostly integrated into the 2 countries. However, separatists occasionally rose in rebellion. It was during one such rebellion that the king lost his eye. King Alden then turned his attention to Sigtrun and said formally for all those assembled to hear, Jarl Sigtrun, our good fellow, your king owes you a debt. But we would impose upon you once more. Will you sail ahead to your Bossberg and arrange further supplies for the journey of this mission? Just announcing him thus was a great honor afforded to Sigtrun. He immediately took a knee and, through barely contained emotion, responded, You honor me, your Majesty. It will be done. Well, that settles it. The rest of you may take your leave. However, we would ask assembled military leaders to remain in the courtyard. We will have further matters to discuss with you, so we shall summon you again shortly. Venna gently touched Jarl Sigtrun on the shoulder and said, Thank you, my lord, for everything. She made to bow, but Sigtrun stopped her. I should probably bow to you, Highness. Venna winced and said, Please don't. I am not. Anyway, may I ask a small favor of you, my lord? Anything. If it is in my power, it shall be done. Can you send my regards to Brenda Sogard, and a promise for Eric to wed her daughter? We have danced around it, but I need to make that official once and for all. Although her request was earnest, Venna had an ulterior motive. Jarl Sigtrin beamed as he realized it was her doing him the favor, by offering him an excuse to see Brenda. He bowed and said, "It would be my pleasure, noble Lady Venna." He clasped her shoulders briefly, said his farewells to her 2 boys, and disappeared amongst the crowd. There were some unhappy grumblings and animated conversations, but no one dared blatantly voice their protest. Once the chamber had cleared of all the additional people, the royals relaxed. Venna cleared her throat and spoke, saying, "Your Majesty, if I may?" "You may." "The prisoner. I think we should bring him too. I believe we can convince him, one way or the other, that it is in his interests to give us information to assist us while we are in Neven lands." "Of course. And if he doesn't cooperate, you can always peel him and toss him overboard." "Very well, it shall be so. Thank you, Majesty." King Ulden then addressed them all. "Now that we have all of that sorted, we will send Shufi. He is formidable, resourceful, has many contacts, and also speaks 3 other languages common in the Empire. He will be invaluable." To everyone's surprise, Thane said, "I too will go." "Like hell you will." King Ulden angrily shot back. "You have an entire country to run. You can't just run off on adventures whenever the mood takes you. I taught you better than that." "What?" "Hold on, hear me out on this, father." Thane paused momentarily. "Well, I'm waiting. Justify this nonsense." "You see, as it stands, father, the truth of the matter is, Ilsa practically runs scored. No one questions her, and she is a much more capable administrator than I. I didn't marry her just because she looks good, you know." At that, he shot the Duchess a sly smile. The hazel-eyed buxom blonde gave him a withering look, then rolled her eyes as she smiled and gently shook her head. He went on, "Besides, it will make this venture more official. And it justifies our bringing a larger contingent of armed men. We cannot have a prince of the realm getting around without a sufficient escort, now can we? I will bring 30 mounted huskarls from my personal guard." The king made as if to object, but thought about it and conceded the point. "Actually, that is rather sound." Agreed. "I too will go," said Gerald. "Absolutely not. I forbid it," said the king forcefully. Then added, "By the gods, why don't we all just pack up and go, eh?" Gerald gestured towards Orn. "Sire, the lad needs instruction. Please trust me when I say this, Your Majesty. You want him to be taught. I am old. My journey draws ever towards its last leg, but his journey is just beginning." The king had a grim look on his face, tinged with some sadness as he realized Gerald's implication. After a few moments of thought, he relented. "Fine, fine." King Ulden put on an air of resignation, but he appraised Orn as he thought about the future and how the boy could benefit the kingdom. Hrolf spoke up and proudly announced, "You may borrow Ansar Fenna, the Arctic Wolf, champion, and pride of Bruderman." Viggen's brows shot up as he responded incredulously, "Just one man. He is all that is needed. You will understand when you see." Then, wearing a smug smile, Hrolf leaned in and said to Viggen, "He is berserk." "What do you mean, borrow?" "Well, I want him back. Besides, what are you contributing, Viggen?" "A shield maiden, her warrior sons, a translator merchant, 8 mounted heavy cavalrymen in the form of Olsbocky knights, and I am providing ships and supplies for the trip. How can you claim credit for the first things?" Hrolf asked incredulously. "They're all my subjects." "They're Holverlin," Viggen retorted, wearing a smug grin. "But they all volunteered, so it doesn't count." "Enough. By the gods, you are still such children," King Ulden admonished. "Besides Hrolf, with just the ships alone he has contributed more. You always were a tight ass. Makes me think your mother was unfaithful." This set everyone to laughing except Hrolf, who sulked and muttered, "But he is berserk." Chapter 9. The previous day, a squall had moved in off the coast of the Neven Empire as Gracchus' ship moved along the shore. He looked forward to reaching the dock. Seeing an ominous wall of dark, scudding clouds on the horizon is any sailor's worst nightmare. It was fortunate for Gracchus that the violent sea had exhausted its ferocity before showering the ship with rain from the edge of the storm. Gracchus had decided not to return to Discipica. He instead opted to detour southeast to the town of Rogus, just shy of 1,000 miles from Discipica, east-southeast along the Neven coast. It had been 4 days since they'd left that accursed island, and from the last time he checked his charts, they would arrive at the Rogus dock soon. After noting this, he was about to shout for Vanna out of habit before he caught himself. Instead, he called out, "Menedus." His newly promoted mate came thumping along the deck and responded in a deep voice. "Aye, sir." He was a thick-set man with close-cropped dark hair and deep-set, dark eyes. His long nose kinked towards the right, where someone had broken it some time ago, and his head appeared joined straight into the center of his shoulders. "Order the men to furl sail and get those stinky pricks on the oars to earn their bread." "Aye, sir." "Furl sail." "Man oars." "Do me a favor next time, will you?" asked Gracchus in a soft voice. "Sir." Then Gracchus shouted, "Piss off over there before you do that. I don't need my eardrums blasted." "Aye, sir, sorry, sir." Gracchus was despondent. On taking stock, he'd lost almost half of the landing party, including Vanna. To make matters worse, he couldn't account for some of them. So, he didn't know whether the men were dead or captured. If the Haldermen captured them, they most likely would learn that it wasn't the Nevan Imperial Legion who raided them. While they had captured 6 Haldermen, including that giant of a man, they didn't capture any women. He had personal experience regarding the martial prowess of the Haldermen. However, he'd never imagined a small, backwoods village could put up such a fight. Discipline had broken down, with some of his men chasing village women instead of focusing on taking captives. They were lucky to have grabbed any captives, considering how it went wrong. Still, no slave could match the loss of Vanna. He had been with Gracchus for half his life. He shook his head as if to dislodge those gloomy thoughts. But his mind kept tracing back to them. His lack of knowing was eating at him. Why the uniforms? Why raid a country that the imperial government had a treaty with? And then the realization came to him. Gracchus was sly and crafty. He knew how to manipulate uneducated men using their basest desires, but he was not what one would call scholarly. However, he had his moments, and this was one of those. And so, he began realizing that his mysterious benefactor was a member of the Senate, hence the Senate guardsmen in the tavern that night. The reason they were to raid in Legion garb was because that senator wanted to start a war between the Halder nations and the Nevan Empire. For what purpose the senator was trying to spark this conflict, he knew not. Gracchus had decided it wasn't important. What was important was the fact that he was neck-deep in something he wished to be as far away from as possible. Maybe he would sail far to the west and seek refuge in the Hyenas Union before things got bad. Suddenly roused from his internal machinations by the first mate's deep booming voice, Gracchus heard him shout, "Stand to, ready the docking lines." The ship was approaching the dock, and soon he could offload the last of the evidence of what he'd been involved in. The uniforms were already at the bottom of the sea. All he needed to do was sell the captives, collect his gold, and then he would disappear for a good long while. Once the crew tied off the lines and extended the gangplanks, Gracchus left Menedus in charge. He ordered him to feed and water the slaves and get the men started on cleaning and refurbishing the ship. They needed to be ready for the run along the coast to Discipica. He left Menedus 10 gold coins to purchase food stores and said to him, "Do not visit the tavern. Take 2 or 3 good men to carry the supplies back with you." Gracchus went ashore and made a beeline for the outskirts of town, to where the arena slave holding pens were, so he could talk with the pitmaster. On his way, he cast his eyes about. He had a bad feeling nagging at him, and he couldn't shake it. His instincts were not indicating imminent danger, but he had an undeniable sense of foreboding. He dismissed those ominous thoughts as he arrived at a large iron-barred gate. It was the entrance to a walled-off compound. The guard lazily eyed him over and said, "State your business." Gracchus, peevish from his pervasive feeling of doom, responded sharply, "Mind your tone, cocksnot, or I'll remove your vocal cords." "Really, and just who?" A soft, effeminate male voice cut him off from inside the compound. The fresh voice lisped, "I'd listen to him, darling. The man's a viper." Gracchus smiled as he recognized the man's voice. "Flavius, you old bumboy. How have you been?" "Fabulous as always, darling. Surrounded by gorgeous, sweaty, manly men. Life is..." He stopped talking as he inhaled deeply through his nose, and as he exhaled said, "Go OD." He then giggled girlishly. The only possible description for the man approaching the gate would be pretty. He dressed in a white tunic, belted at the waist, with a gold-colored silk cape off the left shoulder that he had draped over the crook of his left arm. On his head was a laurel wreath, interspersed with pink daisies around a head of meticulously curled dark brown hair. His dark eyes stood out because of the eyeliner, creating a border between his skin and the whites of his eyes. Gracchus had been dealing with Flavius for many years. Over that time, although he wouldn't consider Flavius a friend, he had developed a mutual respect and fondness for the man. "And how are you, you naughty thing?" Flavius asked, his eyes flashing as he turned his head slightly, and grinned. "Been better. Can we talk? I've got something you might be interested in." "My word, yes, yes, of course, darling." He then addressed the guard, saying, "Well, don't just stand there like a wooden dick at an orgy. Let him in, darling. Heavens above. So hard to get good help these days." Flavius sighed as he touched his fingers to his forehead, striking a tragic pose. A half-hour later, Gracchus had convinced Flavius to bring his lion cage carriage to the wharf where his ship had docked. He explained the need for it being a man he had captured. Flavius tried to press him for details, but Gracchus just kept telling him, "Trust me, when you see, you'll see. Words can't do it justice." In the end, Flavius, thoroughly intrigued by the mystery, threw up his hands in exasperation and agreed. Thus, Gracchus arrived back at the docks, riding along with Flavius in his chariot, the horse-drawn lion cage following. Surrounding the cage were 6 guards armed with steel-tipped spears. Flavius accompanied Gracchus onto the ship, and down into the hold. Flavius, as one who hadn't acclimated to the smells on board a slave galley, held a perfumed kerchief over his nose. As Flavius' eyes adjusted to the dimly lit windowless space, they almost bulged out of their sockets. Tied to the wall was the largest man he'd ever seen. A man who stared right through him in a manner that nearly caused him to lose control of his bladder. "Ah, Gracchus darling," Flavius said in a shaky voice, "what exactly am I looking at here?" "He and the 5 others in the cage over there are aldermen we captured during a raid." Flavius let out a soft, nervous tittering laugh as he said, "I have questions. Oh, so many questions, but I don't think I will like the answers. So I will ask the most important one. How much?" "I was thinking 100 gold for the lot." Flavius snapped his eyes onto Gracchus with an injured expression and responded with, "Oh, please, do be serious, darling. I'm not buying your ship. Let's say I give you 25 for the giant fellow, and 10 for the other 5. I have such plans for this dangerous-looking fellow." "Sheesh, Flavius, at least buy me dinner before you bend me over." 80, best I can do. 30 for the big man, and 15 for the rest." Before Gracchus could retort, Flavius cut him off, saying, "Be serious, Gracchus darling. You'll want to get these men out of your hair." He smiled cheekily as he looked at Gracchus' balding pate. "Believe me, you won't get a better offer." The look in his eyes was one of sincere sympathy. He genuinely believed what he was saying. Gracchus thought about it for a few moments and said, "All right, screw it. 45 for the lot, then." They shook hands on it, and Flavius held Gracchus's hand a moment longer, slipping it away as his attention drifted back to the enormous figure tied to the bulkhead. He cautiously edged closer to the giant man secured to the wall. Leaning in, he tried getting a closer look at his face when the giant man shifted his weight. This sudden movement caused Flavius to let out a short, high-pitched "ew" as he leapt back in fright. He then giggled uneasily and headed back up on deck, tripping slightly as he kept looking back at Vilder in admiration. It took 6 powerful men to get Vilder into the lion cage. Gracchus was taking no chances with him as he had no leverage to ensure compliance. They moved him hogtied, by laying him face down on a sheet of canvas, then with 4 men at the head, and 2 at the feet, carried him off the ship, straight into the cage. All 6 men heaved and yanked the canvas out from under him. The other 5 men had their wrists shackled behind their backs, with metal collars placed on their necks. A chain linked them as they were forced to march along behind the carriage. After his acquisitions were secure, Flavius counted out the coins and handed them over to Gracchus, who stowed them in the pouch inside his tunic. With a barely hidden, troubled expression, Gracchus held his hand out to shake Flavius's. A crowd had gathered around the slaves. Light-colored hair was a rarity in this nation, and blue eyes were rarer still. Of particular interest was the figure in the cage. Although lying prone and trussed up, it was still quite obvious this man was massive. The guards surrounding the slaves held their spears across their chests as a barrier to prevent any lollygaggers from getting too close. "Until next time, precious," said Flavius, ignoring the hand, and opting instead to embrace Gracchus, pressing their cheeks together, and kissing once on each side. He then said, "Nah, don't fret, dear," as he squeezed his shoulders in a conciliatory gesture. "You're a resourceful man. Whatever's troubling you, I'm sure you'll find your way through it. Well then, totter." With that, Flavius twirled and half walked, half skipped down the gangplank. He then hopped up nimbly onto his chariot and, with an exaggerated hand gesture, signaled his men to move on. Gracchus stared after him from the deck of his ship until he disappeared from view, then shook off his reverie. He called out to Menedus, who promptly appeared with an, "Aye, sir." "Menedus, cast off. We're leaving. It'll be about a week along the coast, and we're not stopping till we get there. We've gold to collect, and the sooner we do, the sooner we can make ourselves scarce." "Aye, sir." "Leave it with me." Vilda crouched at the far end of the cage. His meal was untouched, on a wooden plate near the cage entrance. Flavius approached, pausing while a guard whispered something in his ear. He then simpered as he sashayed to the cage. Vilda barely moved as he eyed the man bending toward his cage door. The man said something in Nevan. He tried another language. At last, he tried Olsbocky, and a flash of recognition crossed Vilda's eyes. "Why do you not cooperate?" Vilda responded in Olsbocky. "Why would I? I'm here against my will." With a slow, deliberate movement, the man stood and folded his arms. "I am Flavius Drusilla. Now that we can communicate, I will tell you that you are where you are. This is your life now. You may as well get used to it. I will leave. One way or another, you will let me leave. Or many of your people will die, maybe even you. You choose," said Vilda nonchalantly. Flavius checked his fingernails. "Maybe. Or maybe you will die." He looked up at Vilda. "Look, I paid for you. That is reality. To me, it matters not how you came here." In a sudden move, Vilda launched forward with frightening speed and shot his arm through the bars. Flavius flinched, Vilda's fingertips stopping a mere hair's breadth from his face, the bars preventing him from reaching further. Then Vilda calmly withdrew his arm and sat back down. He'd moved so quickly that the guards had no time to react. His heart pounding, Flavius took a few breaths to calm himself while maintaining a veneer of unflappability. "Feel better, now that you got that out of your system?" Vilda simply shrugged. "Sooner or later." A look of frustration crossed Flavius's face, and he sighed as he closed his eyes, touching his fingertips to his forehead. "You cost me a lot of coin. I intend on making it back and then some. Let us make a deal." Vilda looked at him but said nothing. "If you cooperate, and at least make me double what I paid for you, then I will sign a writ of release from servitude. How does that sound?" "And if I refuse?" asked Vilda. "Well, I will sell you on, and you become someone else's problem. But believe me when I tell you this, handsome. Your best chance is to stick with me. I will make you a god. All you have to do is fight. You can fight, can't you? I have a family. I need to get back to them. You are in my country now. There is nowhere to go. You cannot speak the language, and you will be hunted down, alone, with no coin, no friends, no hope. It would not end well for you. Here, slaves are trained to fight in the arena. People pay to see, and people gamble. That is how I make money. You help me make money, and I help you by giving you your freedom. When I've made enough, of course." Vilda mulled it over in his mind as Flavius then said, "Now, I want to get that leg of yours treated. It looks nasty. Can I have your word you won't be silly?" Vilda stood up to his full imposing height. He looked his captor in the eye and said, "I swear by the gods, I will not hurt them unless they attack me. If I am attacked, I shall break them. Otherwise, it is agreed. I will fight. But only fight. I will do nothing else." A brief, disappointed frown creased Flavius' face as he realized the giant man's implication. Vilda then asked, "What of the others?" "The other 5 from my village." "Ah yes. What of them?" "They do not fight. I will fight. They will not clear. That is not part of our arrangement. I don't care. It's a condition. I will fight. They will not. They can do reasonable work to earn their keep, And I will make enough for their freedom too. Flavius frowned again as he considered. Then he clapped and smiled as he said, "Lovely, darling, lovely. We have a deal. You should call me master by rights, but I am reasonably sure you won't, so Flavius is fine by me." He giggled, then said, "And what shall I call you?" "I am Vilda Avdlak." "Ooh, that's an ugly mouthful. Ah, no offense of course. We need something simpler for the plebs to cry out." "I had a nickname. I never liked it, but it should be easy to pronounce. Black Bear. Ah yes, yes. That is perfect." Flavius gushed and said dramatically, "The Black Bear," as he turned to leave. He stopped a moment and added, "Please behave, Vilda, darling. I will send the healer." Outside the area of the cell, Flavius turned to the trainer and, speaking in Nevan, said, "He will cooperate now. But do not make any aggressive moves. I am certain that you would regret it." The trainer responded, "But he is a slave. We should break him." "Oh, good heavens no, darling," Flavius said as he gently caressed the trainer's cheek. "He is a star. Besides, you trap more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. Now, do be a dear and fetch the healer, and give our new talent a proper meal." He then sauntered away once more, crying, "The Black Bear," as he giggled inanely. The trainer shuddered in revulsion at his touch but knew better than to disobey. For all the sashaying and simpering, Flavius could be utterly ruthless when the occasion required. The next afternoon, Vilda followed the trainer into a room. Armored sleeves, helmets, and various weapons lined the walls. The smell of metal, and the oil used to prevent rust wafted by him as he scanned the racks, eliciting a small pang of loss as he thought of his forge, his home. He ignored the armor and helmets, as none would fit him. Walking along the rack, he browsed until he spotted something that appealed to him. A mace, 3.5 feet long. It had a leather-wrapped handgrip long enough for 2 Nevan hands, topped with a plain, solid iron ball. Vilda picked it up with his right hand, hefting it. Pursing his lips as he tested its weight, he found its balance. He then made several test swings, the mace causing a low whistle as it cut through the air. The trainer flinched at the mace tip slicing the air near his head, stepping back warily. Vilda's calloused hands bit into the slight give of the leather grip. He then nodded at the trainer and said, "This will do." The trainer didn't understand what he said, but the meaning was obvious, so he nodded in response. As they were about to exit the room, Vilda spotted some Jamadi round shields leaning against a wall. He picked the one without a spike on its boss, then walked towards the room door. He cast a glance over his shoulder before walking out. The trainer led him down a corridor to an opening. As he approached the daylight, he could hear random voices cheering, some yelling. He could understand none of it. The trainer stopped, gesturing for Vilda to continue. Vilda hesitated a moment and then walked into the daylight. He held the shield up to shade his eyes as they adjusted to the brightness. As he cleared the entrance, a large, thick door slammed into place, flush with a 10-foot-high wall. His feet kicked up dust from the pale arena sand, along with the rusty smell of old blood. As he looked around, he saw a wall surrounding the entire pit. Atop it, he could see people whose faces wore expressions of glee and rapt anticipation. It turned Vilda's stomach as he wondered what manner of people would create something like this. At one end of the encircling wall, there was a covered area set 3 feet higher than the rest, where Vilda assumed people of status would sit. The pit ground spanned 60 yards, and at the opposite end stood a man unlike any he had seen before. He stood half a foot shorter than him, a slender figure with well-defined, ropey muscles. What surprised Vilda was that his skin was dark, almost black. The yellow sand formed such a contrast behind him it seemed almost white in comparison. His hair was short with tight curls. He fascinated Vilda. So much so that, while admiring the fluid grace of his movement, it was only Vilda's instincts that saved him. The swarthy man quickly closed the gap between them and thrust the trident he was wielding straight at his chest. Vilda sidestepped and deflected the thrust off to his left with his shield. But his opponent spun right and tried to jam the butt of his trident into Vilda's gut. Barely deflecting that with the haft of his mace, he took a few paces back. There were some cheers, and some hissing from the crowd, but all that fell away into the background. This was life or death, and this man was fast. Vilda's opponent, aware his element of surprise was gone, became more cautious. He felt surprised himself, seeing that this huge man was not as slow as he'd thought. The two men began circling each other. Vilder held his shield at a 30-degree angle from his line of attack, the leading edge facing the other man. He held his mace low but ready. Vilder had entered the calm that he always felt as a familiar surge from within his gut flooded his body, and everything seemed to slow down. As they circled, the gap between them closed slightly, and then Vilder struck. The leading edge of his shield shot forward, catching the trident just behind the head. The force of the blow knocked the weapon off of Vilder's center as Vilder moved forward, swinging the mace back and around for an overhand swing with devastating force. The man wielding the trident caught the blow on the shaft of the weapon, but the force of it jarred his arms fiercely, knocking him down. He rolled backward and regained his feet. Because of the blow he deflected, his hands had lost almost all feeling, and pain shot through his arms. No sooner had he stood up than Vilder was on him, delivering a flurry of strikes that he could barely keep up with. Shield, mace, backhand mace, shield, mace, shield as Vilder pressed him. Then Vilder delivered an overhand strike, and the man rolled forward, past Vilder's right side. But Vilder turned to his left, and butted him to the ground with his shield as the dark-skinned man was getting to his feet. He fell onto his back, and his trident skidded just out of his reach. Both men were breathing hard. The fighter on the ground looked up at Vilder with wide eyes. When Vilder approached him, he closed his eyes, ready for the finishing blow that would end him. His body tensed in anticipation. But then, nothing. He opened his eyes and saw Vilder's immense hand outstretched toward him. He looked into eyes of a color he had never seen before, set in a face with so much hair it seemed to grow out of everywhere. He hesitated a moment and took the hand, and suddenly he was back on his feet. Vilder could hear the crowd now. It seemed they were angry. Some were flinging food into the pit. Then a familiar voice called out in Olsbocki, "It's to the death, darling." Vilder replied angrily, "I agreed to fight. I fought. I won. I don't need to kill this man. I won't." While he was responding, his opponent inched towards his weapon. As the man reached his trident, the doors swung open. From each end, 12 armed and armored men filed out, and began surrounding them. Vilder made ready as he turned, gauging the situation. His eyes met those of the man he had fought, and he gestured to him with a mace, then to himself, and then to the men surrounding them. Vilder's opponent's eyes widened in surprise, and then he flashed Vilder a wicked smile. They were opponents no more. With his foot, the man flicked his trident up to his outstretched hand and stood back to back with him. As the ring of men started to slowly, cautiously close in on the two fighters, Vilder's whole body tensed. His breath became ragged, and a ripping low growl emanated from the back of his throat. His skin flushed, and his eyes turned bloodshot as the growl became a roar. He held his arms outstretched as though inviting them. A fine steam emanated from his skin's surface, and he seemed to expand. The pit guards heavily outnumbered the two, but Vilder, already huge, was even bigger now. They did not relish the prospect of having to take him down. Not to mention the other large man who, for most of the match, held his own against the monster before them. They glanced at each other in apprehension. A voice from the dignitaries' pavilion rang out in Nevin shouting, "Kill them!" At this command, the men tried to rush them, shields forward, spears at the ready. Vilder took 2 running steps and unleashed a forward kick with his left leg that sent the nearest man careening backward. He then swung his shield over to the right, plowing the edge into the next man, who went down like a puppet with its strings cut. He then shield-rammed the man after him. The dark-skinned man threw out a devastating flurry of kicks, thrusts, and cross-checks that had already put 2 of the guards down. Over his shoulder, he could hear what sounded like a bundle of armor dropping from a roof, accompanied by grunts and cries of pain. At this stage, almost half of the armored men were down. The dark-skinned was managing, whereas Vilder was tearing through them. Several cuts marked his skin, but he didn't seem to notice. He swung the mace in a wide arc into the body of yet another guard, folding him like a blanket. The remaining 4 men were backing away now. Vilder's new ally stood firm, while Vilder paced in front of them like a caged animal, breathing like a bellows. And then he shocked everyone. He transferred his mace to his shield hand, and reached down with his right, grasping one of the downed men by his belt. He roared as he hurled him at the others like one would a small sack of flour. The unconscious body slammed into the 2 shields in the middle, knocking the men behind them down in a heap. It was over. At this stage, the crowd was on its feet, stamping and cheering. More men entered the arena floor, and Vilder began moving towards them. The other fighter grasped his shoulder, and Vilder wheeled on him. The fighter held his hands up, and Vilder stopped and stared at him. The fighter's eyes were wide as saucers. When he'd fought the giant, he was fighting a normal person. Albeit a very large one, but a person, nonetheless. What stood before him at that moment was one of the devils his elders would warn children about to make them behave. Vilder was calming down, but he was still alert. The latest people entering the pit were dragging the limp forms of the guards out of the arena. A voice in Nevin rang out above the din, and the crowd slowly settled down. Friends. 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 What did we think of that? The crowd's cheers rose, fading as the announcer's voice continued. We have the Gajeji warrior, and we have the Black Bear. At first, opponents, and now, allies. The crowd cheered, accompanied by the sound of stomping feet. From the entrance that Vilder had come from, the trainer gestured for him to come. Vilder was about to offer his hand to his former opponent when he noticed the man had frozen. More armed men, wearing different styled equipment, entered the pit from his opponent's side. Vilder stood beside him, at the ready. Just when it seemed the pit was about to erupt into violence again, two well-dressed Nevins emerged from the opponent's entrance. It was Flavius in the company of a hard-looking man who had the appearance and bearing of someone who had spent a good deal of his life fighting. Flavius spoke a few words to the man in Nevin. They shook hands, and then the other man made a hand gesture that appeared to dismiss Vilder's former opponent, and left the pit with half the armed men. Flavius then said to Vilder in Olsbocki, "Quite the first showing, my fine, large fellow. You gave a spectacle that people will speak of throughout the Empire. And now you have a new teammate, it would seem." He then regarded the other fellow, said a few words in Nevin to him, turned back to Vilder and said, "Go, eat, rest. Get acquainted with your new friend here." Flavius then turned to head back through the opposite entrance, and said over his shoulder, "I am expecting great things from the two of you, haha." The Dark Man and the Black Bear. Today was a great day. A great day indeed. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. And check out the links. Also, stay tuned as the Chronicles of Orn continues in Episode 3.